This lesson is about the origins of World War I and trench warfare. Question that we start with is, why does the world explode in 1914? What are the conditions that create this massive cataclysm which kills tens of millions of people? Why is the world so fragile in 1914? Well, some of the reasons are that the war begins obviously in Europe, although it extends obviously to the entire world. And one of the broad reasons that the world is on the brink is the competition inside Europe for many colonies around the world. Those European powers, many of them are not just confined to Europe. They have colonial possessions, quote unquote, all around the world, in Africa, in Asia, etc. And each of those nations in Europe seeks power for themselves to a certain extent at the extent of others. So they're always seeking to have more power in relation to each other. Germany wants more power than Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary wants more power than France. France wants more power than England. And they're all really competing for more power and space on the continent. One of the other reasons why the world is on the brink is that each of these powers has been increasing their military power over the course of really the last 30 years. For the previous few decades, these powers have been building up their armaments in anticipation of a war with each other. So these relatively small European countries are all very powerful on the world stage. They are generally very wealthy, and they have been increasing the amount of armaments that they have been building in preparation for a war which they believe may come at some point. Another really important part about this is that these countries would not be able to increase their military armaments if they had not industrialized earlier, if they had not already built up their ability to create many of these armaments ahead of time. And as these countries industrialize, they become more powerful internationally, and they increasingly compete with each other. Another reason why the world is on the brink is that each of these countries also has become fiercely nationalistic. Each of these nations believes that, to a certain extent, that their nation, and each of these nations' peoples, believes to a certain extent that their nation is superior. They have connected this form of nationalism to this sort of deep patriotic pride, and many of the people of these nations see their country's worth based on their worth as reflected against the other countries on the European continent. Specifically in relation to Germany, and this is not to blame Germany for the war. Germany would be blamed for the war by England and France, particularly after the war. But Germany is a key to understanding why the world explodes, because Germany is a new country. Germany has really only unified under what we today know as Germany in really about 1870. The other nation states of Europe, such as Russia, France, and England, have had a longer history of unification inside the borders that we commonly know of them today. And in the Franco-Prussian War, the war between France and Prussia in 1870, 1871, Germany had kind of coalesced after that war, and had coalesced under the person of Otto von Bismarck, and Germany had coalesced in the image, to a certain extent, of a military power. The leadership of this new Germany had always been one in which the regalia of the military had been prominent, and that this had always been part and parcel of this new German identity. Another aspect of this is that under German unification, Germany is really at the center, and we'll see a map in a second. Germany is really at the center of Europe and is seeking for itself more room and more power. And often Germany felt itself kind of hemmed into Central Europe, whereas other nations such as France and England had powerful navies. Germany desired a more powerful navy and desired a more powerful world footprint after unification. And in doing that, that growing power of Germany starts to upset this balance on the continent. Many of these other powers were perfectly happy with Germany not being unified before, because the idea was that Germany would be weaker. What starts to develop over the course, and we'll talk about this more, is two power blocks, one called the Triple Alliance and one called the Triple Entente. These two alliances, made up of different countries on the European continent, start to make agreements with each other, many of them secret, based on what would happen should war break out. Germany is going to have something called the Schlieffen Plan, which is named after von Schlieffen, who is the military leader who comes up with the plan. And the idea is that if anything happens on the continent, if there's any start of a war, Germany must attack swiftly and quickly. And we'll see why they believe this in a second. And of course, so that Schlieffen Plan is one of the reasons why the world explodes, because Germany acts very, very quickly once there's any hint of the beginning of conflict. Another thing is that there's always going to be one spark, and that spark is going to be why the world explodes. The immediate reason for the war is the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Sarajevo in 1914. That one assassination is going to start a whole series of dominoes, which is going to mire Europe in war for the next 4 years. Going to the Schlieffen Plan, the Schlieffen Plan had as their concept, and this went all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, that if there was any sort of war, the line between Germany and France, Germany had to attack and pacify France quickly. The reason being is that if Germany was going to be stuck in a war in which they had two fronts, for instance, one front against Russia to the east and one front against France to the west, they would have to neutralize France very quickly. And in the Schlieffen concept or Schlieffen Plan, as soon as war broke out, Russia had to sweep across, instead of sweeping across this heavily defended front here in France, sweep across the neutral country of Belgium, take over Paris, and then turn its attention to Russia. And so the Schlieffen concept basically meant that this had to be done very, very, very quickly. Here are the different power blocks as war emerged. You had Germany and Austria-Hungary, which had agreements with each other that if either of the other one went to war, that they would defend each other. And notice how they were both in sort of Central Europe. And then you had the Triple Entente, which consisted really primarily of the countries of the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, which, as you can see, France and Russia both surround Germany and Austria-Hungary. So again, you remember the Schlieffen concept, Germany will sweep across this border. This is the post-World War I map to the right. So we'll talk about that, will be discussed later. This is sort of a bubble version of these different alliances because it's really complicated. But as long as you understand that the Triple Entente consists of Russia, France, and Britain, these are the years that these agreements are made, and that the Triple Alliance generally consisted of Austria, Hungary, and Germany, with Italy to a certain extent, and also the Ottoman Empire. These are the two basic sides in this conflict. So how does the Great War come about? Well, you have the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, Turkey is another way of talking about the Ottoman Empire. And they have a mutual aid agreement. In 1907, going back a few years before the start of the war, Russia, the United Kingdom, and France formed this Triple Entente to counter German, Austria-Hungarian power and Italian power. Italy, by the way, leaves the war before it's over, so that's why it kind of becomes confusing as to who's Italy's alliances to. And there's a balance of power here. Each of these powers is making sure that these powers are not outstripping their power at their expense. Problems with this balance of power arrangement is that it's predicated on a series of triggers. So that if any one of these powers is attacked, or as in what's going to happen, if any one of these powers that this power is aligned with is attacked by another power, this could cause a series of dominoes which could create this massive war. The war really begins in a region which is at first not even part of Austria-Hungary or any of these, which is why it's so fragile. The Balkan area, which consists of an area which today you might have heard of nations such as Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. This region would later be called Yugoslavia. In any case, this area is an area that Austria-Hungary desired more power in. So Austria-Hungary wanted to exert more power in this Balkan region. This region had previously been largely under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which is later going to be primarily centered in Turkey. Well, the Ottoman Empire had really been crumbling for a very, very long time, had been decaying, and by 1914 was really on the brink of splintering entirely. And so in 1908, Austria-Hungary seizes this area of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Serbia and Russia are very angry at this move. Notice Serbia here. Serbia and Russia. Now, Serbia is closely allied with Russia and still is today, by the way. And so Serbia is angry that that Austria-Hungary, which is right on their border, has seized this region right to their west, which Serbia itself has believed at various points historically has been part of sort of a quote unquote greater Serbia. So there's a competition here. And so when this happens, Russia and Serbia are both angry at Austria-Hungary making any moves in this region. Well, in 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austria-Hungary Empire, goes with his wife to Sarajevo, and goes with his wife, and there in Sarajevo, he is actually assassinated by a man named Gustav Princip. Princip is a member of the Black Hand, which is kind of like a group of Serbian nationalists who assassinate Franz Ferdinand, again, the heir to the Austria-Hungary Empire, in the streets of Sarajevo. And this causes a whole series of dominoes across the continent to fall. First, Austria-Hungary declares war, demands that Serbia apologize, and demands all of these demands from Serbia, which Serbia tries to make good on. But in any case, Austria-Hungary ends up declaring war on Serbia, even though Serbia tries to apologize for this. And this starts to cause chaos. Because once Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Russia, who is an ally with Serbia, moves to defend Serbia. So they make a move to try to defend Serbia. Germany, in what might seem a preemptive move, but remember the Schlieffen concept. Remember that idea that Germany had, that if war started out, Germany had to attack France, and then once it pacified France, turn its attention to its Eastern Front. Well, Germany declares war simultaneously because it's allied with Austria-Hungary. Once Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Russia comes in defense of Serbia. Germany then declares war on both Russia and France at the same time and immediately invades France. And you might be like, wait, this is all happening down here. Why is Germany moving into France? Well, that's part of their concept. That's part of their idea. So remember, this is happening very, very fast. The UK, who's allied with France and Russia, declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. So now you have two main blocks. You have the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, later Italy, Japan, and Russia. And then you have the Central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and Bulgaria. And these two main blocks are going to be the two basic sides in this war. Well, one aspect of this, which we have to understand, is you often associate World War I and the start of World War I which we've just sort of covered, we often associate World War I with trench warfare. Why does the war become frozen so quickly? Why do these powers, many of which assume, both sides assume, that the war is going to be over very, very quickly? They both assume that this is going to be a war which is going to be over in a series of months. Well, the problem is that each side believes that their strategy is superior and will result in the war being over very quickly. Now, remember the Schlieffen Plan. Well, Schlieffen, by the way, is dead by this point, and there's a new leader named von Moltke who kind of takes over the Schlieffen Plan and puts it into effect. And in that initial invasion across Belgium and then going towards Paris to pacify France, Germany runs into basically the English and French armies defending Paris in August 1914, and runs into a battle called the Battle of the Marne. This Battle of the Marne ends up with Germany's army actually being split in two. And in being split in two, they're not able to take over Paris. They're not able to affect the most important part of their plan, which is to take France out of the war immediately. So France is still in the war. And what results is a series of battles which are called the Race to the Sea. And this race to the sea, as we'll see in the next map, is what causes the line of trenches, which then get frozen for most of the war on what is going to be called the Western Front. Here's the Battle of the Marne. I won't go over this too much, but in any case, Germany gets very, very close to Paris, as you can see, but then there's a counterattack by the French and the British, and they're able to move the Germans back and split their army. As a result, here's Paris. The German army starts to consolidate their power along this front. Remember, they've come in through Belgium here. And the German army starts to consolidate its front, and the Germans keep trying to outflank the British. So they keep trying to move around the British to get around to Paris along this line here. And in each time they do that, the British repel them over and over and over and over and over again. And both sides are basically moving over this series of battles all the way to the North Sea. All along this line from the North Sea down to where these two sides first met is where a series of trenches are going to be dug. So there's a series of trenches hundreds of miles long, which are dug, and across this, in this sort of battlefield, which is going to be devoid of trees, is going to be almost completely wiped out. This is where the armies on the Western Front, the German, French, and British armies, are essentially going to be frozen for most of the war. So the war stalemates. And in that stalemate, in these trenches, in these terrible conditions in trench warfare, that is where so many deaths are going to occur. Because in each case, each army is going to try to push back the other over a course of years and really achieve no territorial gains whatsoever. And this is really going to be the legacy of at least the Western Front in World War I, and what we know of as trench warfare, which is usually associated with mainly the Western Front, although to a certain extent took place in other places, but mainly the Western Front. So that's really the origins of how World War I comes about, through a series of these sort of dominoes of these different powers sort of declaring war on each other, and how the war gets frozen and doesn't end for 4 years and results in so many of these deaths.